So I went to the Commissioner Mr. Griffith's office. All about the staircase leading to the office, I saw soldiers armed from top to toe as though for military action. The veranda was all astir. When I was admitted to the office, I saw Mr. Bowring sitting with Mr. Griffith. I described to the Commissioner the scenes I had witnessed. He replied briefly. I did not want the procession to proceed to the fort, as a disturbance was inevitable there. And as I saw that the people would not listen to persuasion, I could not help ordering the mounted police to charge through the crowd. But, said I, you knew what the consequences must be. The horses were bound to trample on the people. I think it was quite unnecessary to send that contingent of mounted men. You cannot judge that, said Mr. Griffith. We police officers know better than you the effect of your teaching on the people. If we did not start with drastic measures, the situation would pass out of our hands. I tell you that the people are sure to go out of your control. Disobedience of law will quickly appeal to them. It is beyond them to understand the duty of keeping peaceful. I have no doubt about your intentions, but the people will not understand them. They will follow their natural instinct. It is there that I join issue with you, I replied. The people are not by nature violent, but peaceful. And thus we argued at length. Ultimately, Mr. Griffith said, but suppose you were convinced that your teaching had been lost on the people, what would you do? I should suspend civil disobedience, if I was so convinced. What do you mean? You told Mr. Bowring that you would proceed to the Punjab the moment you were released? Yes, I wanted to do so by the next available train, but it is out of the question today. If you will be patient, the conviction is sure to grow on you. Do you know what is happening in Ahmedabad? And what has happened in Amritsar? People have everywhere gone nearly mad. I am not yet in possession of all the facts. The telegraph wires have been cut in some places. I put it to you that the responsibility for all these disturbances lies on you. I assure you I should really take it upon myself wherever I discovered it. But I should be deeply pained and surprised if I found that there were disturbances in Ahmedabad. I cannot answer for Amritsar. I have never been there, no one knows me there. But even about the Punjab, I am certain of this much that, had not the Punjab government prevented my entry into the Punjab, I should have been considerably helpful in keeping the peace there. By preventing me, they gave the people unnecessary provocation. And so we argued on and on. It was impossible for us to agree. I told him that I intended to address a meeting on Chowpatty and ask the people to keep the peace, and took leave of him. The meeting was held on the Chowpatty sands. I spoke at length on the duty of non-violence and on the limitations of Satyagraha and said, Satyagraha is essentially a weapon of the truthful. A Satyagrahi is pledged to non-violence, and unless people observe it in thought, word and deed, I cannot offer mass Satyagraha. Anasuya Behan too had received news of disturbances in Ahmedabad. Someone had spread a rumor that she also had been arrested. The mill hands had gone mad over her rumored arrest, struck work and committed acts of violence, and a sergeant had been done to death. I proceeded to Ahmedabad. I learnt that an attempt had been made to pull up the rails near the Nadiad railway station, that a government officer had been murdered in Viramgam, and that Ahmedabad was under martial law. The people were terror-stricken. They had indulged in acts of violence and were being made to pay for them with interest. A police officer was waiting at the station to escort me to Mr. Pratt, the commissioner. I found him in a state of rage. I spoke to him gently and expressed my regret for the disturbances. I suggested that martial law was unnecessary and declared my readiness to cooperate in all efforts to restore peace. I asked for permission to hold a public meeting on the grounds of the Sabarmati ashram. The proposal appealed to him and the meeting was held, I think on Sunday, the 13th of April, and martial law was withdrawn the same day or the day after. Addressing the meeting, I tried to bring home to the people the sense of their wrong, declared a penitential fast of 3 days for myself, appealed to the people to go on a similar fast for a day, and suggested to those who had been guilty of acts of violence to confess their guilt. I saw my duty as clear as daylight. It was unbearable for me to find that the laborers, amongst whom I had spent a good deal of my time, whom I had served, and from whom I had expected better things, had taken part in the riots, and I felt I was a sharer in their guilt. Just as I suggested to the people to confess their guilt, I suggested to the government to condone their crimes. Neither accepted my suggestion. The late Sir Raman Bhai and other citizens of Ahmedabad came to me with an appeal to suspend Satyagraha. The appeal was needless, for I had already made up my mind to suspend Satyagraha so long as the people had not learnt the lesson of peace. The friends went away happy. There were, however, others who were unhappy over the decision. They felt that if I expected peace everywhere and regarded it as a condition precedent to launching Satyagraha, mass Satyagraha would be an impossibility. I was sorry to disagree with them. If those amongst whom I worked and whom I expected to be prepared for non-violence and self-suffering could not be non-violent, Satyagraha was certainly impossible. I was firmly of opinion that those who wanted to lead the people to Satyagraha ought to be able to keep the people within the limited non-violence expected of them. I hold the same opinion even today. Almost immediately after the Ahmedabad meeting, I went to Nadiad. It was here that I first used the expression Himalayan miscalculation, which obtained such a wide currency afterwards. Even at Ahmedabad, I had begun to have a dim perception of my mistake. But when I reached Nadiad and saw the actual state of things there and heard reports about a large number of people from Kheda district having been arrested, it suddenly dawned upon me that I had committed a grave error in calling upon the people in the Kheda district and elsewhere to launch upon civil disobedience prematurely as it now seemed to me. I was addressing a public meeting. My confession brought down upon me no small amount of ridicule, but I have never regretted having made that confession. For I have always held that it is only when one sees one's own mistakes with a convex lens and does just the reverse in the case of others that one is able to arrive at a just relative estimate of the two. I further believe that a scrupulous and conscientious observance of this rule is necessary for one who wants to be a Satyagrahi. Let us now see what that Himalayan miscalculation was. Before one can be fit for the practice of civil disobedience, one must have rendered a willing and respectful obedience to the state laws. For the most part, we obey such laws out of fear of the penalty for their breach, and this holds good particularly in respect of such laws as do not involve a moral principle. For instance, an honest, respectful man will not suddenly take to stealing whether there is a law against stealing or not, but this very man will not feel any remorse for failure to observe the rule about carrying headlights on bicycles after dark. Indeed, it is doubtful whether he would even accept advice kindly about being more careful in this respect. But he would observe any obligatory rule of this kind if only to escape the inconvenience of facing a prosecution for a breach of the rule. Such compliance is not, however, the willing and spontaneous obedience that is required of a Satyagrahi. A Satyagrahi obeys the laws of society intelligently and of his own free will because he considers it to be his sacred duty to do so. It is only when a person has thus obeyed the laws of society scrupulously that he is in a position to judge as to which particular rules are good and just and which are unjust and iniquitous. Only then does the right accrue to him of the civil disobedience of certain laws in well-defined circumstances. My error lay in my failure to observe this necessary limitation. I had called on the people to launch upon civil disobedience before they had thus qualified themselves for it, and this mistake seemed to me of Himalayan magnitude. As soon as I entered the Kheda district, all the old recollections of the Kheda Satyagraha struggle came back to me, and I wondered how I could have failed to perceive what was so obvious. I realized that before a people could be fit for offering civil disobedience, they should thoroughly understand its deeper implications. That being so, before restarting civil disobedience on a mass scale, it would be necessary to create a band of well-tried, pure-hearted volunteers who thoroughly understood the strict conditions of Satyagraha. They could explain these to the people and by sleepless vigilance keep them on the right path. With these thoughts filling my mind, I reached Bombay, raised a corps of Satyagrahi volunteers through the Satyagraha Sabha there, and with their help commenced the work of educating the people with regard to the meaning and inner significance of Satyagraha. This was principally done by issuing leaflets of an educative character bearing on the subject. But whilst this work was going on, I could see that it was a difficult task to interest the people in the peaceful side of Satyagraha. The volunteers too failed to enlist themselves in large numbers. Nor did all those who actually enlisted take anything like a regular systematic training, and as the days passed by, the number of fresh recruits began gradually to dwindle instead of to grow. I realized that the progress of the training in civil disobedience was not going to be as rapid as I had at first expected. Thus, whilst this movement for the preservation of non-violence was making steady though slow progress on the one hand, government's policy of lawless repression was in full career on the other and was manifesting itself in the Punjab in all its nakedness. Leaders were put under arrest. Martial law, which in other words meant no law, was proclaimed. Special tribunals were set up. These tribunals were not courts of justice, but instruments for carrying out the arbitrary will of an autocrat. Sentences were passed unwarranted by evidence and in flagrant violation of justice. In Amritsar, innocent men and women were made to crawl like worms on their bellies. Before this outrage, the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy paled into insignificance in my eyes, though it was this massacre principally that attracted the attention of the people of India and of the world. I was pressed to proceed to the Punjab immediately in disregard of consequences. I wrote and also telegraphed to the Viceroy asking for permission to go there, but in vain. If I proceeded without the necessary permission, I should not be allowed to cross the boundary of the Punjab, but left to find what satisfaction I could from civil disobedience. I was thus confronted by a serious dilemma. As things stood, to break the order against my entry into the Punjab could, it seemed to me, hardly be classed as civil disobedience, for I did not see around me the kind of peaceful atmosphere that I wanted, and the unbridled repression in the Punjab had further served to aggravate and deepen the feelings of resentment. For me, therefore, to offer civil disobedience at such a time, even if it were possible, would have been like fanning the flame. I therefore decided not to proceed to the Punjab in spite of the suggestion of friends. It was a bitter pill for me to swallow. Tales of rank injustice and oppression came pouring in daily from the Punjab, but all I could do was to sit helplessly by and gnash my teeth. Just then, Mr. Horniman, in whose hands the Bombay Chronicle had become a formidable force, was suddenly spirited away by the authorities. This act of the government seemed to me to be surrounded by a foulness which still stings in my nostrils. I know that Mr. Horniman never desired lawlessness. He had not liked my breaking the prohibitory order of the Punjab government without the permission of the Satyagraha Committee and had fully endorsed the decision to suspend civil disobedience. I had even received from him a letter advising suspension before I had announced my decision to that effect. Only owing to the distance between Bombay and Ahmedabad, I got the letter after the announcement. His sudden deportation, therefore, caused me as much pain as surprise. As a result of these developments, I was asked by the directors of the Bombay Chronicle to take up the responsibility of conducting that paper. Mr. Brelvi was already there on the staff, so not much remained to be done by me. But as usual with my nature, the responsibility would have become an additional tax. But the government came, as it were, to my rescue, for by its order the publication of the Chronicle had to be suspended. The friends who were directing the management of the Chronicle, namely Messrs. Umar Sobani and Shankarlal Bankar, were at this time also controlling Young India. They suggested that, in view of the suppression of the Chronicle, I should now take up the editorship of Young India, and that, in order to fill the gap left by the former, Young India should be converted from a weekly into a bi-weekly organ. This was what I felt also. I was anxious to expound the inner meaning of Satyagraha to the public, and also hoped that through this effort I should at least be able to do justice to the Punjab situation. For behind all I wrote, there was a potential Satyagraha, and the government knew as much. I therefore readily accepted the suggestion made by these friends. But how could the general public be trained in Satyagraha through the medium of English? My principal field of work lay in Gujarat. Sergeant Indulal Yagnik was at that time associated with the group of Messrs. Sobani and Bankar. He was conducting the Gujarati monthly Navajivan, which had the financial backing of these friends. They placed the monthly at my disposal, and further Sergeant Indulal offered to work on it. This monthly was converted into a weekly. In the meantime, the Chronicle was resuscitated. Young India was therefore restored to its original weekly form. To have published the two weeklies from two different places would have been very inconvenient to me and involved more expenditure. As Navajivan was already being published from Ahmedabad, Young India was also removed there at my suggestion. There were other reasons besides for this change. I had already learnt from my experience of Indian opinion that such journals needed a press of their own. Moreover, the press laws in force in India at that time were such that if I wanted to express my views untrammeled, the existing printing presses, which were naturally run for business, would have hesitated to publish them. The need for setting up a press of our own, therefore, became all the more imperative, and since this could be conveniently done only at Ahmedabad, Young India too had to be taken there. Through these journals, I now commenced, to the best of my ability, the work of educating the reading public in Satyagraha. Both of them had reached a very wide circulation, which at one time rose to the neighborhood of 40,000 each. But while the circulation of Navajivan went up at a bound, that of Young India increased only by slow degrees. After my incarceration, the circulation of both these journals fell to a low ebb, and today stands below 8,000. From the very start, I set my face against taking advertisements in these journals. I do not think that they have lost anything thereby. On the contrary, it is my belief that it has in no small measure helped them to maintain their independence. Incidentally, these journals helped me also, to some extent, to remain at peace with myself, for whilst immediate resort to civil disobedience was out of the question, They enabled me freely to ventilate my views and to put heart into the people. Thus I feel that both the journals rendered good service to the people in this hour of trial and did their humble bit towards lightening the tyranny of the martial law. Sir Michael O'Dwyer held me responsible for all that had happened in the Punjab, and some irate young Punjabis held me responsible for the martial law. They asserted that if only I had not suspended civil disobedience, there would have been no Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Some of them even went the length of threatening me with assassination if I went to the Punjab. But I felt that my position was so correct and above question that no intelligent person could misunderstand it. I was impatient to go to the Punjab. I had never been there before, and that made me all the more anxious to see things for myself. Dr. Satyapal, Dr. Kichlu, and Pandit Rambhaj Dutt Chowdhury, who had invited me to the Punjab, were at this time in jail. But I felt sure that the government could not dare to keep them and the other prisoners in prison for long. A large number of Punjabis used to come and see me whenever I was in Bombay. I ministered to them a word of cheer on these occasions, and that would comfort them. My self-confidence of that time was infectious. But my going to the Punjab had to be postponed again and again. The Viceroy would say, "Not yet," every time I asked for permission to go there, and so the thing dragged on. In the meantime, the Hunter Committee was announced to hold an inquiry in connection with the Punjab government's doings under the martial law. Mr. C.F. Andrews had now reached the Punjab. His letters gave a heart-rending description of the state of things there, and I formed the impression that the martial law atrocities were, in fact, even worse than the press reports had showed. He pressed me urgently to come and join him. At the same time, Malaviyaji sent telegrams asking me to proceed to the Punjab at once. I once more telegraphed to the Viceroy asking whether I could now go to the Punjab. He wired back in reply that I could go there after a certain date. I cannot exactly recollect now, but I think it was the 17th of October. The scene that I witnessed on my arrival at Lahore can never be effaced from my memory. The railway station was from end to end one seething mass of humanity. The entire populace had turned out of doors in eager expectation as if to meet a dear relation after a long separation, and was delirious with joy. I was put up at the late Pandit Rambhaj Dutt's bungalow, and the burden of entertaining me fell on the shoulders of Srimati Sarala Devi. A burden it truly was, for even then as now, the place where I was accommodated became a veritable caravanserai. Owing to the principal Punjab leaders being in jail, their place I found had been properly taken up by Pandit Malaviyaji, Pandit Motilalji, and the late Swami Shraddhanandji. Malaviyaji and Shraddhanandji I had known intimately before, but this was the first occasion on which I came in close personal contact with Motilalji. All these leaders, as also such local leaders as had escaped the privilege of going to jail, at once made me feel perfectly at home amongst them, so that I never felt like a stranger in their midst. How we unanimously decided not to lead evidence before the Hunter Committee is now a matter of history. The reasons for the decision were published at the time and need not be recapitulated here. Suffice it to say that, looking back upon these events from this distance of time, I still feel that our decision to boycott the committee was absolutely correct and proper. As a logical consequence of the boycott of the Hunter Committee, it was decided to appoint a non-official inquiry committee to hold almost a parallel inquiry on behalf of the Congress. Pandit Motilal Nehru, the late Deshabandhu C.R. Das, Sergeant Abbas Tyabji, Sergeant M.R. Jayakar, and myself were appointed to this committee virtually by Pandit Malaviyaji. We distributed ourselves over various places for purposes of inquiry. The responsibility for organizing the work of the committee devolved on me, and as the privilege of conducting the inquiry in the largest number of places fell to my lot, I got a rare opportunity of observing at close quarters the people of the Punjab and the Punjab villages. In the course of my inquiry, I made acquaintance with the women of the Punjab also. It was as if we had known one another for ages. Wherever I went, they came flocking and laid before me their heaps of yarn. My work in connection with the inquiry brought home to me the fact that the Punjab could become a great field for khadi work. As I proceeded further and further with my inquiry into the atrocities that had been committed on the people, I came across tales of government's tyranny and the arbitrary despotism of its officers such as I was hardly prepared for, and they filled me with deep pain. What surprised me then, and what still continues to fill me with surprise, was the fact that a province that had furnished the largest number of soldiers to the British government during the war should have taken all these brutal excesses lying down. The task of drafting the report of this committee was also entrusted to me. I would recommend a perusal of this report to anyone who wants to have an idea of the kind of atrocities that were perpetrated on the Punjab people. All that I wish to say here about it is that there is not a single conscious exaggeration in it anywhere, and every statement made in it is substantiated by evidence. Moreover, the evidence published was only a fraction of what was in the committee's possession. Not a single statement regarding the validity of which there was the slightest room for doubt was permitted to appear in the report. This report, prepared as it was solely with a view to bringing out the truth and nothing but the truth, will enable the reader to see to what lengths the British government is capable of going and what inhumanities and barbarities it is capable of perpetrating in order to maintain its power. So far as I am aware, not a single statement made in this report has ever been disproved. We must now leave for the time being these dark happenings in the Punjab. The Congress inquiry into diarism in the Punjab had just commenced when I received a letter of invitation to be present at a joint conference of Hindus and Mussalmans that was to meet at Delhi to deliberate on the Khilafat question. Among the signatories to it were the late Hakim Ajmal Khan Sahib and Mr. Asaf Ali. The late Swami Shraddhanand Ji, it was stated, would be attending, and, if I remember aright, he was to be the vice president of the conference, which, so far as I can recollect, was to be held in the November of that year. The conference was to deliberate on the situation arising out of the Khilafat betrayal, and on the question as to whether the Hindus and Mussalmans should take any part in the peace celebrations. The letter of invitation went on to say, among other things, that not only the Khilafat question, but the question of cow protection as well would be discussed at the conference, and it would, therefore, afford a golden opportunity for a settlement of the cow question. I did not like this reference to the cow question. In my letter, in reply to the invitation, therefore, whilst promising to do my best to attend, I suggested that the two questions should not be mixed up together or considered in the spirit of a bargain, but should be decided on their own merits and treated separately. With these thoughts filling my mind, I went to the conference. It was a very well-attended gathering, though it did not present the spectacle of later gatherings that were attended by tens of thousands. I discussed the question referred to above with the late Swami Shraddhanand Ji, who was present at the conference. He appreciated my argument and left it to me to place it before the conference. I likewise discussed it with the late Hakim Sahib. Before the conference, I contended that if the Khilafat question had a just and legitimate basis, as I believe it had, and if the government had really committed a gross injustice, the Hindus were bound to stand by the Mussalmans in their demand for the redress of the Khilafat wrong. It would ill become them to bring in the cow question in this connection or to use the occasion to make terms with the Mussalmans, just as it would ill become the Mussalmans to offer to stop cow slaughter as a price for the Hindus' support on the Khilafat question. But it would be another matter and quite graceful and reflect great credit on them if the Mussalmans of their own free will stopped cow slaughter out of regard for the religious sentiments of the Hindus and from a sense of duty towards them as neighbors and children of the same soil. To take up such an independent attitude was, I contended, their duty and would enhance the dignity of their conduct. But if the Mussalmans considered it as their neighborly duty to stop cow slaughter, they should do so regardless of whether the Hindus helped them in the Khilafat or not. That being so, I argued, the two questions should be discussed independently of each other, and the deliberations of the conference should be confined to the question of the Khilafat only. My argument appealed to those present, and as a result, the question of cow protection was not discussed at this conference. But in spite of my warning, Maulana Abdul Bari Sahib said, "No matter whether the Hindus help us or not, the Mussalmans ought, as the countrymen of the Hindus, out of regard for the latter's susceptibilities, to give up cow slaughter." And at one time it almost looked as if they would really put an end to it. There was a suggestion from some quarters that the Punjab question should be tacked on to that of the Khilafat wrong. I opposed the proposal. The Punjab question, I said, was a local affair and could not therefore weigh with us in our decision to participate or not in the peace celebrations. If we mixed up the local question with the Khilafat question, which arose directly out of the peace terms, we should be guilty of a serious indiscretion. My argument easily carried conviction. Maulana Hasrat Mohani was present in this meeting. I had known him even before, but it was only here that I discovered what a fighter he was. We differed from each other almost from the very beginning, and in several matters the differences have persisted. Among the numerous resolutions that were passed at this conference, one called upon both Hindus and Mussalmans to take the Swadeshi vow and, as a natural corollary to it, to boycott foreign goods. Khadi had not as yet found its proper place. This was not a resolution that Hasrat Sahib would accept. His object was to wreak vengeance on the British Empire in case justice was denied in the matter of the Khilafat. Accordingly, he brought in a counter-proposal for the boycott purely of British goods so far as practicable. I opposed it on the score of principle as also of practicability, adducing for it those arguments that have now become pretty familiar. I also put before the conference my viewpoint of non-violence. I noticed that my arguments made a deep impression on the audience. Before me, Hasrat Mohani's speech had been received with such loud acclamations that I was afraid that mine would only be a cry in the wilderness. I had made bold to speak only because I felt it would be a dereliction of duty not to lay my views before the conference. But to my agreeable surprise, my speech was followed with the closest attention by those present and evoked a full measure of support among those on the platform, and speaker after speaker rose to deliver speeches in support of my views. The leaders were able to see that not only would the boycott of British goods fail of its purpose, but would, if adopted, make of them a laughing stock. There was hardly a man present in that assembly but had some article of a British manufacture on his person. Many of the audience, therefore, realized that nothing but harm could result from adopting a resolution that even those who voted for it were unable to carry out. Mere boycott of a foreign cloth cannot satisfy us, for who knows how long it will be before we shall be able to manufacture Swadeshi cloth in sufficient quantity for our needs, and before we can bring about effective boycott of a foreign cloth. We want something that will produce an immediate effect on the British. Let your boycott of foreign cloth stand, we do not mind it, but give us something quicker and speedier in addition. So spoke in effect Maulana Hasrat Mohani. Even as I was listening to him, I felt that something new over and above boycott of foreign cloth would be necessary. An immediate boycott of foreign cloth seemed to me also to be a clear impossibility at that time. I did not then know that we could, if we liked, produce enough khadi for all our clothing requirements. This was only a later discovery. On the other hand, I knew even then that if we depended on the mills alone for effecting the boycott of foreign cloth, we should be betrayed. I was still in the middle of this dilemma when the Maulana concluded his speech. I was handicapped for want of suitable Hindi or Urdu words. This was my first occasion for delivering an argumentative speech before an audience especially composed of Mussalmans of the North. I had spoken in Urdu at the Muslim League at Calcutta, but it was only for a few minutes, and the speech was intended only to be a feeling appeal to the audience. Here, on the contrary, I was faced with a critical, if not hostile audience, to whom I had to explain and bring home my viewpoint. But I had cast aside all shyness. I was not there to deliver an address in the faultless, polished Urdu of the Delhi Muslims, but to place before the gathering my views in such broken Hindi as I could command. And in this I was successful. This meeting afforded me a direct proof of the fact that Hindi Urdu alone can become the lingua franca of India. Had I spoken in English, I could not have produced the impression that I did on the audience, and the Maulana might not have felt called upon to deliver his challenge. Nor, if he had delivered it, could I have taken it up effectively. I could not hit upon a suitable Hindi or Urdu word for the new idea, and that put me out somewhat. At last, I described it by the word non-cooperation, an expression that I used for the first time at this meeting. As the Maulana was delivering his speech, it seemed to me that it was vain for him to talk about effective resistance to a government with which he was cooperating in more than one thing if resort to arms was impossible or undesirable. The only true resistance to the government, it therefore seemed to me, was to cease to cooperate with it. Thus I arrived at the word non-cooperation. I had not then a clear idea of its manifold implications. I therefore did not enter into details. I simply said, the Mussalmans have adopted a very important resolution. If the peace terms are unfavorable to them, which may, God forbid, they will stop all cooperation with government. It is an inalienable right of the people thus to withhold cooperation. We are not bound to retain government titles and honors or to continue in government service. If government should betray us in a great cause like the Khilafat, we could not do otherwise than non-cooperate. We are therefore entitled to non-cooperate with government in case of a betrayal. But months elapsed before the word non-cooperation became current coin. For the time being, it was lost in the proceedings of the conference. Indeed, when I supported the cooperation resolution at the Congress, which met at Amritsar a month later, I did so in the hope that the betrayal would never come. The Punjab government could not keep in confinement the hundreds of Punjabis who, under the martial law regime, had been clapped into jail on the strength of the most meager evidence by tribunals that were courts only in name. There was such an outcry all round against this flagrant piece of injustice that their further incarceration became impossible. Most of the prisoners were released before the Congress opened. Lala Harkishan Lal and the other leaders were all released, while the session of the Congress was still in progress. The Ali brothers too arrived there straight from jail. The people's joy knew no bounds. Pandit Motilal Nehru, who, at the sacrifice of his splendid practice, had made the Punjab his headquarters and had done great service, was the President of the Congress. The late Swami Shraddhanand Ji was the chairman of the reception committee. Up to this time, my share in the annual proceedings of the Congress was confined only to the constructive advocacy of Hindi by making my speech in the national language and to presenting in that speech the case of the Indians overseas. Nor did I expect to be called upon to do anything more this year. But, as had happened on many a previous occasion, responsible work came to me all of a sudden. The King's announcement on the new reforms had just been issued. It was not wholly satisfactory even to me and was unsatisfactory to everyone else. But I felt at the time that the reforms, though defective, could still be accepted. I felt in the King's announcement and its language the hand of Lord Sinha, and it lent a ray of hope. But experienced stalwarts like the late Lokamanya and Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das shook their heads. Pandit Malaviya ji was neutral. Pandit Malaviya ji had harbored me in his own room. I had a glimpse of the simplicity of his life on the occasion of the foundation ceremony of the Hindu University. But on this occasion, being in the same room with him, I was able to observe his daily routine in the closest detail, and what I saw filled me with joyful surprise. His room presented the appearance of a free inn for all the poor. You could hardly cross from one end to the other. It was so crowded. It was accessible at all odd hours to chance visitors who had the license to take as much of his time as they liked. In a corner of this crib lay my charpai in all its dignity. But I may not occupy this chapter with a description of Malaviyaji's mode of living and must return to my subject. I was thus enabled to hold daily discussions with Malaviyaji, who used lovingly to explain to me, like an elder brother, the various viewpoints of the different parties. I saw that my participation in the deliberations on the resolution on the reforms was inevitable. Having had my share of responsibility in the drawing up of the Congress report on the Punjab wrongs, I felt that all that still remained to be done in that connection must claim my attention. There had to be dealings with the government in that matter. Then similarly there was the Khilafat question. I further believed at the time that Mr. Montagu would not betray or allow India's cause to be betrayed. The release of the Ali brothers and other prisoners too seemed to me to be an auspicious sign. In these circumstances, I felt that a resolution not rejecting but accepting the reforms was the correct thing. Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das, on the other hand, held firmly to the view that the reforms ought to be rejected as wholly inadequate and unsatisfactory. The late Lokamanya was more or less neutral, but had decided to throw in his weight on the side of any resolution that the Deshabandhu might approve. The idea of having to differ from such seasoned, well-tried and universally revered leaders was unbearable to me. But on the other hand, the voice of conscience was clear. I tried to run away from the Congress and suggested to Pandit Malaviya ji and Motilal ji that it would be in the general interest if I absented myself from the Congress for the rest of the session. It would save me from having to make an exhibition of my difference with such esteemed leaders. But my suggestion found no favor with these two seniors. The news of my proposal was somehow whispered to Lala Harkishan Lal. "This will never do. It will very much hurt the feelings of the Punjabis," he said. I discussed the matter with Lokamanya, Deshabandhu and Mr. Jinnah, but no way out could be found. Finally, I laid bare my distress to Malaviya ji. "I see no prospect of a compromise," I told him, "and if I am to move my resolution, a division will have to be called and votes taken. But I do not find here any arrangements for it. The practice in the open session of the Congress so far has been to take votes by a show of hands, with the result that all distinction between visitors and delegates is lost, while, as for taking a count of votes in such vast assemblies, we have no means at all. So it comes to this, that even if I want to call a division, there will be no facility for it nor meaning in it. But Lala Harkishan Lal came to the rescue and undertook to make the necessary arrangements. "We will not," he said, "permit visitors in the Congress Pandal on the day on which voting is to take place. And as for taking the count, well, I shall see to that. But you must not absent yourself from the Congress." I capitulated. I framed my resolution and in heart trembling undertook to move it. Pandit Malaviyaji and Mr. Jinnah were to support it. I could notice that although our difference of opinion was free from any trace of bitterness, and although our speeches too contained nothing but cold reasoning, the people could not stand the very fact of a difference. It pained them. They wanted unanimity. Even while speeches were being delivered, efforts to settle the difference were being made on the platform, and notes were being freely exchanged among the leaders for that purpose. Malaviya ji was leaving no stone unturned to bridge the gulf. Just then, Jairam Das handed over his amendment to me and pleaded in his own sweet manner to save the delegates from the dilemma of a division. His amendment appealed to me. Malaviyaji's eye was already scanning every quarter for a ray of hope. I told him that Jairam Das' amendment seemed to me to be likely to be acceptable to both the parties. The Lokamanya, to whom it was next shown, said, "If C.R. Das approves, I will have no objection." Deshabandhu at last thawed and cast a look towards Sergeant Bipin Chandra Pal for endorsement. Malaviyaji was filled with hope. He snatched away the slip of paper containing the amendment and, before Deshabandhu had even pronounced a definite yes, shouted out, "Brother delegates, you will be glad to learn that a compromise had been reached." What followed beggars description. The pandal was rent with the clapping of hands, and the erstwhile gloomy faces of the audience lit up with joy. It is hardly necessary to deal with the text of the amendment. My object here is only to describe how this resolution was undertaken as part of my experiments with which these chapters deal. The compromise further increased my responsibility. I must regard my participation in Congress proceedings at Amritsar as my real entrance into the Congress politics. My attendance at the previous Congress was nothing more, perhaps, than an annual renewal of allegiance to the Congress. I never felt on these occasions that I had any other work cut out for me except that of a mere private, nor did I desire more. My experience of Amritsar had shown that there were one or two things for which perhaps I had some aptitude and which could be useful to the Congress. I could already see that the late Lokamanya, the Deshabandhu, Pandit Motilal ji and other leaders were pleased with my work in connection with the Punjab inquiry. They used to invite me to their formal gatherings where, as I found, resolutions for the subjects committee were conceived. At these gatherings, only those persons were invited who enjoyed the special confidence of the leaders and whose services were needed by them. Interlopers also sometimes found their way to these meetings. There were, for the coming year, two things which interested me, as I had some aptitude for them. One of these was the memorial of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. The Congress had passed a resolution for it amid great enthusiasm. A fund of about 5 lakhs had to be collected for it. I was appointed one of the trustees. Pandit Malaviyaji enjoyed the reputation of being the prince among beggars for the public cause. But I knew that I was not far behind him in that respect. It was whilst I was in South Africa that I discovered my capacity in this direction. I had not the unrivaled magic of Malaviya ji for commanding princely donations from the potentates of India. But I knew that there was no question of approaching the Rajas and Maharajas for donations for the Jallianwala Bagh Memorial. The main responsibility for the collection thus fell, as I had expected, on my shoulders. The generous citizens of Bombay subscribed most liberally, and the Memorial Trust has at present a handsome credit balance in the bank. But the problem that faces the country today is what kind of memorial to erect on the ground to sanctify which Hindus, Mussalmans and Sikhs mingled their blood. The three communities, instead of being bound in a bond of amity and love, are, to all appearance, at war with one another, and the nation is at a loss as to how to utilize the memorial fund. My other aptitude which the Congress could utilize was as a draftsman. The Congress leaders had found that I had a faculty for condensed expression which I had acquired by long practice. The then existing constitution of the Congress was Gokhale's legacy. He had framed a few rules which served as a basis for running the Congress machinery. The interesting history of the framing of these rules I had learnt from Gokhale's own lips. But everybody had now come to feel that these rules were no longer adequate for the ever-increasing business of the Congress. The question had been coming up year after year. The Congress at that time had practically no machinery functioning during the interval between session and session or for dealing with fresh contingencies that might arise in the course of the year. The existing rules provided for 3 secretaries, but as a matter of fact, only one of them was a functioning secretary, and even he was not a whole-timer. How was he, single-handed, to run the Congress office, to think of the future, or to discharge during the current year the obligations contracted by the Congress in the past? During that year, therefore, everybody felt that this question would assume all the more importance. The Congress was too unwieldy a body for the discussion of public affairs. There was no limit set to the number of delegates in the Congress or to the number of delegates that each province could return. Some improvement upon the existing chaotic condition was thus felt by everybody to be an imperative necessity. I undertook the responsibility of framing a constitution on one condition. I saw that there were 2 leaders, namely the Lokamanya and the Deshabandhu, who had the greatest hold on the public. I requested that they, as the representatives of the people, should be associated with me on the committee for framing the constitution. But since it was obvious that they would not have the time personally to participate in the constitution-making work, I suggested that 2 persons enjoying their confidence should be appointed along with me on the Constitution Committee, and that the number of its personnel should be limited to 3. The suggestion was accepted by the late Lokamanya and the late Deshabandhu, who suggested the names of Sergeants Kelkar and I.B. Sen, respectively, as their proxies. The Constitution Committee could not even once come together, but we were able to consult with each other by correspondence and in the end presented a unanimous report. I regard this Constitution with a certain measure of pride. I hold that if we could fully work out this Constitution, the mere fact of working it out would bring us Swaraj. With the assumption of this responsibility, I may be said to have made my real entrance into the Congress politics.